for more than 3 millennia. An object, both dazzling and deeply enigmatic, lay hidden under the sands and stones of the Valley of the Kings. The gold funerary mask of Pharaoh Tutankhamun waited there in the dark, untouched by time and unseen by human eyes, its polished surface and fine features encapsulating the astonishing skill and artistry of ancient Egyptian goldsmiths. Standing about 21 inches tall, the mask isn't merely a symbol of a young king's status. It is a technological and spiritual achievement, stitched together by beliefs about the afterlife and crafted through techniques that still inspire awe. And yet, as remarkable as it looks from the outside, its most surprising story didn't come to light until X-rays pierced the gold and revealed secrets no one expected. Tutankhamun, often lovingly shortened to King Tut in modern times, was the last ruler of his line during Egypt's 18th dynasty. He ascended the throne as a child, about 9 years old, and reigned for roughly a decade before dying unexpectedly at around 18. In his own era, Tutankhamun wasn't a celebrated conqueror or a long-lived lawgiver. In fact, later rulers largely sidelined him. His name didn't command reverence in life or in immediate memory. His tomb wasn't draped in the same perpetual attention as those of more famous rulers. It seems even the grave robbers, who pillaged so many royal resting places in the Valley of the Kings, overlooked his burial entirely. On the surface, that might sound a little tragic, a king forgotten so soon after his death. But paradoxically, that neglect was the best possible outcome for modern archaeology, because Tutankhamun's tomb was essentially forgotten. It was preserved to a degree that is almost unbelievable. While other tombs in the valley were violated, stripped, or rearranged by thieves and intrusive visitors across centuries, his remained sealed for over 3,000 years. When Howard Carter and his team finally discovered it in 1922, what they found was nothing short of extraordinary. Inside, more than 5,000 items were carefully placed: furniture, clothing, jewelry, weapons, ceremonial objects, food and drink, games, oils, perfumes, and, of course, the nested coffins that held the pharaoh's mummy. The discovery instantly elevated Tutankhamun from a near-forgotten king to one of the most famous pharaohs in the world. The media reported breathlessly on the riches, the artistry, and the sheer number of objects. And among those treasures, one item stood above the rest: the gold mask that gazed back with a serene expression and a lifelike presence that felt both intimate and eternal. The mask, renowned for its elegant features and precise details, was believed to be an accurate likeness of Tutankhamun, a portrait intended to make the king recognizably himself in the realm beyond death. In ancient Egyptian belief, an accurate depiction of the face had a spiritual job to do. It helped the soul, variously understood as the Ba, the Ka, and other spiritual aspects, identify the body, return to it, and continue life in the afterworld. The mask thus played an active role in ensuring the continuity of the king's identity across the divide between this world and the next. Even a casual glance at the workmanship shows the extraordinary skill it took to produce. The smooth planes of the cheeks, the full lips, the embedded inlays of obsidian and quartz for the eyes, the bands of blue that imitate lapis lazuli in the striped Nemes headdress, all of it testifies to the practiced hand of master craftsmen. People always understood it was difficult to make. But the true complexity of the mask, its construction, its materials, its internal architecture, didn't fully dawn on scholars until decades after its discovery, when science gave them fresh eyes. The first X-ray studies of the mask were carried out in 1970, prompted not by curiosity alone, but by necessity. The mask was going to Paris for a major exhibition, its first trip outside of Egypt, and conservators wanted baseline images to track any changes, structural weaknesses, or previously unnoticed restorations. That initial set of images also offered clues about the underlying craftsmanship, though many of those clues would lie dormant for years, while analytical tools improved and methods evolved. At the time 0.65s, no one quite grasped how multi-layered and intricate the mask's internal fabrication really was. Egyptian goldsmiths did not have access to modern solders, torches, or laser welders. How, then, did they attach elements without the heat and filler metals we rely on today? The answer unfolded slowly, with each new study adding a piece to the puzzle. A new round of X-rays in 2007 clarified some of those technical mysteries. The mask is not pure 24-karat gold. It's primarily 23-karat, meaning the gold was alloyed with other metals. Analysis showed small but significant amounts of copper present in the sheet gold, imparting a slightly warmer hue and, crucially, making the metal more workable. Floating microscopic copper gives gold a touch more hardness and spring, which helps it hold detailed work and endure shaping by hammering. The ancient goldsmiths formed the mask by repeatedly heating and hammering thin sheets over a model, annealing the metal to soften it, and then hammering again to refine the contours. A cycle repeated until the final, graceful form appeared. The copper in the alloy likely made the process smoother and more predictable. The 2007 images also hinted that the mask was constructed in multiple parts, joined with remarkable precision, rather than a single monolithic piece, which makes the fidelity of the face all the more impressive. One of the strangest chapters in the mask's modern story came in 2014, when staff at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo were adjusting the mask's display and the elongated ceremonial beard accidentally detached. Some reports suggest it had grown loose and fell off. Others say it was knocked. Either way, the incident caused an uproar. The mask is not just a national treasure. It's an international icon and a cornerstone of cultural tourism in Cairo. So the urgency to fix it was immense. The restoration team began by documenting the mask's condition in exhaustive detail, including a full 3D scan. This step was intended to guide a careful repair, but it yielded an unexpected bonus. A hidden structural element came into view. Inside the beard was a small gold tube, essentially a sleeve or socket, likely designed to attach the beard securely to the chi, time 0.95. In other words, the ancient craftsman had engineered a removable attachment system. That discovery reinforced a key point. The mask's construction involved far more than shaping a pretty face. There were clever mechanical solutions at work as well, bespoke joinery done in gold, so to speak, to ensure that separate parts fit together both elegantly and securely. Even with these findings, the mask hasn't run out of mysteries. For generations, people accepted the idea that its features faithfully reproduce Tutankhamun's face. But some scholars now think the likeness may not have been tailor-made for Tut at all. In 2010, a study proposed that the mask was originally crafted for a female pharaoh, possibly Nefertiti, often thought to be Tutankhamun's stepmother or a close relative who may have reigned independently in the twilight years of the Amarna period. The strongest clue comes from the inscriptions. When conservators and epigraphers examined the cartouches closely, they noticed irregularities suggesting that Tutankhamun's name was inscribed over an earlier royal name. The underlying traces appeared to reference a different sovereign. According to that line of research, the ghost text beneath the visible inscription may correspond to Nefertiti's royal titulary, implying the mask was retrofitted for Tut at the last minute. Other details also raise eyebrows. The mask has pierced earlobe, time 0.95 s. While young princes might have worn earrings, most male rulers of the period were typically depicted without pierced ears in official portraiture, once they reached adulthood and took up the masculine regalia of kingship. This doesn't prove the mask was made for a woman, but it nudges the needle. Combined with the palimpsest inscription, the pierced ears become another tile in a mosaic of clues suggesting the mask could have been recast, symbolically and literally, from a piece intended for someone else. If true, none of this diminishes its beauty or spiritual function. It just situates the mask more precisely in the complicated politics of succession and burial in a turbulent era. Tutankhamun's tomb, the space that sheltered the mask, is itself brimming with puzzles. One enduring question has been why the burial of a king, even a young one with a brief reign, was so modest compared to the monumental tombs of his new kingdom predecessors. The chambers are small. The plan is simple. The decorative scheme, though gorgeous, is less extensive than the sprawling, deeply carved reliefs in the tombs of more prominent pharaohs. Was this economy of space and decoration an insult, or a logistical necessity? A compelling theory centers on Tut's successor, the pharaoh I. When Tutankhamun died suddenly, the normal practice, beginning construction of a tomb soon after accession and elaborating it across decades, would have been cut short. In contrast, I, who followed Tut on the throne, had time and motive to consolidate power. Researchers exploring A's own tomb noticed a series of painted baboons adorning a wall, a motif that also appears in Tut's burial. The strong similarities in style and content suggest the same workshop or overseer directed the decoration of both tombs. Here's the crucial difference. I's tomb is fit for a king in scale and ambition. Tutankhamun's, by comparison, is compact and hurried. If the same hand guided both projects, it's plausible that A earmarked the larger, more impressive tomb for himself and shunted the deceased Tut into a smaller, available tomb so the burial could proceed without delay. In a culture where ritual timing and proper mortuary rites mattered immensely, speed was essential. Moreover, I may have had reasons to diminish Tutankhamun's memory, smoothing the path for his own legitimacy. The relatively plain tomb makes sense in this context. Ironically, the very simplicity that may have been an insult in political terms is what helped keep plunderers at bay. The tomb's smallness, its accidental concealment, and its unassuming footprint in the valley likely helped it slip through the fingers of thieves. That's why Tutankhamun, overlooked in antiquity, emerged in modern times as a superstar. His face known worldwide, his treasures touring the globe, his mask an icon on posters, book covers, and museum banners. For many people today, the word mummy conjures images from old horror movies, gauze-wrapped figures pursuing the living through torchlit corridors. But in reality, mummies are invaluable archives. They preserve information about the people themselves, their bones, teeth, and soft tissues hold clues to disease, diet, ancestry, and trauma, and they preserve rituals, craft traditions, and cultural anxieties about death and what comes after. Ancient Egyptians, perhaps more than any other civilization, made mummification a centerpiece of their relationship to mortality. Their theology held that life could continue after death if certain conditions were met. The body had to be preserved, time 0.5. The name had to be remembered. The proper rituals had to be performed, and the deceased had to be equipped with goods, food, clothing, tools, amulets, and spells to traverse the dangers of the underworld and arrive at the field of reeds, a kind of idealized afterlife. This worldview wasn't spun from thin air. The Egyptians lived in a landscape whose rhythms fostered a deep belief in renewal. Every year, the Nile flooded its banks, depositing rich silt, followed by retreat and planting, a pattern of inundation and rebirth that structured the calendar and the economy. Every day, the sun disappeared under the western horizon and rose again in the east. Plants withered in the heat, then sprouted anew with the flood's return. The god Osiris came to personify this cycle of death and resurrection. Myth told that Osiris was slain, dismembered, and reassembled by his wife-sister Isis, after which he became lord of the underworld and guarantor of rebirth to those properly prepared. In this framework, time 0.65s, mummification wasn't macabre. It was hopeful, a practical step toward continuity. The process itself evolved across centuries, but certain hallmarks remained. Embalmers carefully dried the body, often with natron, a naturally occurring salt that desiccates tissue. They used resins, oils, and aromatic substances, honey, resins, incense are all mentioned or detected chemically to both preserve and sanctify the remains. Internal organs were removed and treated. The heart was usually left in place as the seat of intellect and emotion. Wrappings of linen, sometimes hundreds of yards of it, were layered with resin to create a protective cocoon. Rituals accompanied these steps. Specialized priests spoke formulaic phrases, and rites like the opening of the mouth ceremonially restored the senses of the deceased so he or she could eat, speak, and breathe in the afterworld. In high-status burials, the process could take roughly 70 days from start to finish, a period corresponding with the time it took for the star Sirius to reappear at dawn, heralding the Nile's inundation, another woven strand linking celestial cycles, earthly rhythms, and funerary practice. No mummy is more famous than Tutankhamun's. Beyond the glitter of his treasures, his very body has taught scientists about the realities of royal life in the New Kingdom. DNA analysis and CT scans have revealed that he suffered from malaria and had skeletal issues in his foot, possibly clubfoot, which could have made walking painful or difficult. The sheer number of walking sticks found in his tomb, dozens upon dozens, aligns with these findings, suggesting they weren't simply royal accessories, but practical aids. His 3 nested coffins, one of them made of solid gold, enclosed his mummy like a set of Russian dolls, protective shells wrapped around a young body prepared for eternity. Another royal who left a deep impression, both on his country and on the archaeological record, is Ramesses II, Ramesses the Great, who reigned for an astonishing 68 years. A builder and campaigner of unmatched energy, he left monuments from the Delta to Nubia, including colossal statues that still tower like stone sentinels. He's estimated to have stood around 6 feet tall and lived to roughly 90 years old, remarkably elderly by ancient standards. Studies of his mummy suggest he suffered from conditions common to old age, possibly arthritis, including spinal issues. His afterlife journey through the millennia was not straightforward. Thieves targeted the Valley of the Kings early in history, spurring priests to hide royal mummies in caches to protect them. Ramesses II wound up in a plain coffin in one such secret collection at Deir el-Bahari, reused and rewrapped centuries after his burial. When that cache was rediscovered in 1881, archaeologists were able to identify him thanks to inscriptions on his wrappings that recorded his identity and the priestly interventions performed to rescue him from desecration. The Egyptians lavished attention not only on bodies but also on tombs, which functioned like carefully curated apartments for the afterlife. The walls of Tutankhamun's tomb, for example, bloom with painted scenes of his funerary rites and his passage through the underworld, guided and protected by gods. These images weren't mere illustrations. They were operable magic, meant to activate protection and provide a map for what lay ahead. Spells from ritual texts, what we call the Book of the Dead, though it's really a collection of spells and hymns rather than a single book, adorned walls and coffins. Egyptians believed that the deceased would face trials and needed passwords, amulets, and knowledge to overcome them. Tombs were filled accordingly. In Tutankhamun's chamber, archaeologists found 36 jars that once held wine or other beverages, and 8 baskets of fruit. The presumption was practical. The journey to the afterlife would be long and arduous. A traveler needs supplies. Clothing was abundant. 2 high-quality tunics, scarves, gloves, and headdresses suggested the dead should be well dressed, their status and comfort maintained. Jewelry, bracelets, pendants, necklaces, rings made of gold and precious stones gleamed in the lamplight of the excavation. Scarab amulets, symbolizing rebirth and protection, figured prominently, some rendered in gold with inlays that shimmer in photos even today. Ostrich feather fans, some mounted on ivory, promised relief from the sun in the world beyond, even if the tomb's interior temperature stays remarkably constant, time 0.65 S, hovering around 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Transportation was a preoccupation. 2. Some pharaohs were interred with full-sized boats. The most famous is the solar bark of Khufu, Cheops, buried in pieces near the Great Pyramid at Giza. When reassembled, it measured about 144 feet long, and it likely served as a ritual vessel intended to carry the resurrected king with the sun god Ra across the celestial waters. Tutankhamun did not have a boat in his tomb, but he did have 11 boat paddles, perhaps symbolic stand-ins or backups for river journeys, and 3 chariots, along with a striking number of walking sticks made from materials like ebony, ivory, silver, and gold, time 0.95s, taken together. Those items paint a picture: a young king prepared to travel by land and water, aided by vehicles and staffs, equipped for mobility and ceremony. Among the most evocative objects found in royal burials are bottles of oils and perfumes. Scents filled with resins and plant essences were luxury goods and also played ritual roles in purification and anointing. In Tutankhamun's tomb, there were clear signs that thieves had once broken in and targeted oils and perfumes along with gold. Jar residues and damaged seals told the tale. Even so, one container still held a trace of an aromatic mixture of coconut oil and frankincense, a combination that opens a sensory portal to the ancient world. Imagine the faint sweetness, the resinous depth, lingering for millennia in the sealed dark. The tomb also yielded games. The Egyptians loved board games, and Senet was among the most popular. Tutankhamun had a travel set made of ivory. While we don't know the exact rules in every detail, scholars have reconstructed enough to suggest it was somewhat like backgammon in the sense of moving pieces across a grid through chance and strategy, perhaps with moral or cosmological allegory baked into the progress of the pieces. It's a curious thought, the idea of a pharaoh in the afterlife shouldering a pack of goods, pausing at a resting place, and taking out a game board to pass the time. We tend to associate deliberate mummification with Egypt, but they weren't the first. The Chinchorro people, who lived along the arid coasts of what is now northern Chile and southern Peru, practiced artificial mummification some 2,000 years before Egyptians perfected their own rituals. The Chinchorro developed techniques to disassemble, treat, and reconstruct bodies, an extraordinary devotion that, like Egypt's, speaks to a view of life and death as porous rather than absolute. And even without human intervention, nature sometimes mummifies. Extremely cold or hot environments, anoxic conditions, or exposure to certain salts or chemicals can halt microbial decay. The most famous example in Europe is Ötzi the Iceman, discovered by hikers in the Alps in 1991. At first, authorities thought he was a modern mountaineer who had died recently. His body was so well preserved in glacial ice. Only later did testing reveal he lived more than 5,000 years ago, during the Copper Age. His skin, clothing, and even stomach contents intact enough to narrate a story of diet, injure, time 0.665 s, and last movements. Not all treasures of the past lie waiting on the surface. In fact, most are buried, and often not by design. Ancient settlements have a way of sinking under their own history. People lived in the same places for centuries, building new structures on the rubble of older ones, discarding waste, leveling ground, burning and rebuilding, and coping with the occasional flood. Sediment from rivers like the Nile could deposit layers on top of old floors. In arid regions, sand and dust move relentlessly, and unless people continually clear them away, they accumulate. Plants contribute to time 9/5. When towns are abandoned, seeds find purchase and vegetation grows, drops its leaves, and decays into new soil, locking old walls and streets under fertile layers. Even massive monuments can disappear. The Sphinx, for instance, spent long stretches of its life buried to the neck in drifting sand until archaeologists excavated it in the 19th century, notably clearing substantial portions in 1817. Given this buried topography, how do archaeologists know where to dig? Sometimes the impetus comes from modern development. Laws require surveys before construction. And if artifacts or ecofacts, organic remains, turn up, archaeological teams step in to document and rescue what they can before bulldozers roll. This is called salvage or rescue archaeology. In other cases, the initiative comes from research questions and historical detective work. Scholars pore over old maps, travelers' accounts, previous excavation reports, and satellite imagery to identify promising locations. A site that has been mentioned in ancient texts or partially dug in the past is particularly enticing because it offers a starting point and context. Before anyone sinks a spade, there's a process of systematic reconnaissance, time 0.95 s. Archaeologists will often establish a grid and perform a pedestrian survey, walking transects and scanning for artifacts on the surface, lithics, pottery sherds, fragments of glass, slag from metalworking, even concentrations of shells and animal bones that might indicate ancient middens. The scatter and density of such materials help map out human activity. Subsurface detection tools provide a different window. Electrical resistivity meters send a current into the ground and measure resistance. Buried walls can block current differently than surrounding soil, creating readable anomalies. Magnetometers detect variations in the Earth's magnetic field caused by features like hearths, pits, or fired clay. Ground-penetrating radar sends radar pulses into the ground and picks up reflections from buried structures or voids. GPS and GIS software then help plot everything precisely, layering data in a digital map that guides excavation with maximum efficiency and minimal disturbance. If your imagination needs a field trip to see the payoff of these methods, consider some of the world's marquee sites. Stonehenge in England is perhaps the most famous of many henges scattered across the British landscape. Picture giant standing stones arranged in a circular outer ring and an inner horseshoe, with lintels creating a post and lintel architecture. Folklore says Merlin, the wizard of Arthurian legend, conjured them into place, spiriting them from distant lands, or that giants hauled them across seas. Others once thought the ruins might be remnants of Roman religious architecture. We now know the stones were raised in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, with construction phases spanning centuries, and that the alignment of the monument captures the sunrise on the summer solstice and the sunset on the winter solstice. The precise purpose remains debated: funerary, astronomical, ceremonial, but that very ambiguity is part of the site's enduring allure. Jump from Salisbury Plain to the Bay of Naples, and you encounter Pompeii. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it blanketed the city in ash and pumice, freezing a slice of Roman life in an instant. Time 0.95 s. Rediscovered in 1748. Pompeii revealed streets, shops, villas with intricate frescoes, an amphitheater that could hold around 20,000 spectators, bath complexes where Romans relaxed and socialized, shrines like the sanctuary of Apollo, and the civic heart in the Forum. Everyday objects, cooking pots, loaves of bread turned to carbon, jewelry, graffiti, offer a tactile connection to the ancient city's last day. The preservation is so complete and so varied that Pompeii became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1997. Sharing that honor with other icons like India's Taj Mahal and Greece's Acropolis. Back in Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza has inspired legends of all sorts. One story claims that Napoleon went inside and emerged shaken and pale, haunted by something he refused to describe. Whether the anecdote is apocryphal or not, it captures the pyramid's power to unsettle and to provoke. To enter is to pass through tight ascending corridors and into the grand gallery, a tall, steeply ramped passage that feels like a stone throat. The king's chamber, lined in enormous blocks of Aswan granite, is austere. No hieroglyphs cover the walls. Elaborate decoration of burial chambers didn't come into fashion until late time 0.95s. Whatever treasures once accompanied the king have long since vanished into antiquity's black market. Tomb robbing is almost as old as the tombs themselves. What remains is the empty granite sarcophagus, too big to fit through the passages, indicating it was installed during construction, not moved in later. The so-called queen's chamber, likely not used for a queen. Intrigues with narrow shafts, whose purpose remains uncertain. Air passages, Symbolic roots for the soul? Scholars still debate. Stories of curses guard these sanctuaries, warning off intruders with horrific fates. In reality, the protective texts on pyramids and tombs were about safeguarding the deceased, not hexing the curious. Still, the myth of a curse has legs, perhaps because it speaks to a sense that some thresholds shouldn't be crossed lightly. When it comes to Tutankhamun's tomb, we don't have to rely on rumor to know what was inside. Unlike the Great Pyramid, in which the burial goods vanished long ago, Tut's chambers were nearly intact when Carter opened them. In addition to the fruits and beverages already mentioned, they were crammed with furniture times 0665s, statues, canes, clothing, over 50 garments of the finest weave, and an array of jewelry that staggers the imagination. Scarabs, associated with protection and rebirth, dotted the collection, as did bracelets, pendants, and rings made of gold and inlaid stone. For comfort, fans made from ostrich feathers waited to stir the air. The tomb also contained a dazzling suite of walking sticks, some in materials that signal both necessity and prestige, and 3 chariots in case the king preferred speed. Curiously, Tutankhamun's tomb held 11 boat paddles, a nod to journeys by water, but no full-sized boat, perhaps a reflection of space constraints or symbolic economy. In the course of the excavation, conservators noted that some jars had been opened and their contents removed, probably by ancient intruders who prized oils and perfumes as much as gold. One bottle, however, still contained a residue, a mixture of coconut oil and frankincense that hints at luxurious scents and ritual anointings. Among the games, the ivory travel set of Senate invites the imagination to a quieter, more domestic scene, a king, gods, and a board where fate and strategy mingle. Who was he supposed to play against? Perhaps the game itself served as a ceremonial instrument, a stand-in for the challenges of the afterlife. The Egyptians had customs we might find odd today. For example, mourning a beloved cat sometimes included shaving one's eyebrows as a sign of grief. Given that, it isn't shocking to find that some tombs contained mummified cats and even mummified scarab beetle, time 0.65s, offerings discovered in large numbers at Saqqara. Cosmetics and their accoutrements, mirrors, coal pots, applicators, appear frequently in burials, used by men and women alike. Eyeliner wasn't merely cosmetic. Compounds in coal may have helped repel insects and cut glare, and the dramatic eyes it created had protective association, time 0.95s. One of the turning points in deciphering the civilization that built all this was the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 by French soldiers during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt. Carved with a decree issued in 196 BCE, it carries the same text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic scripts. That trilingual redundancy gave scholars the Rosetta Stone of the metaphor, an entry point to crack the code of hieroglyphs. In 1822, Jean-François Champollion announced he had deciphered the script, peeling back a veil and opening a flood of reading that, over time, transformed our understanding of Egypt. Female rulers also emerge into clearer focus thanks to archaeology. Hatshepsut, who reigned in the 18th dynasty, was a powerful pharaoh, long overshadowed by her successor, Thutmose III, who erased many inscriptions and images of her reign. When her mummy was identified in 1903, its identity later confirmed by DNA and other clues, her story snapped back into history. She stands today as one of Egypt's most accomplished female leaders, a builder and administrator whose legacy had been buried under deliberate forgetfulness. The Great Pyramid of Giza, besides being ancient and austere, holds a number of records and curiosities. It's the last surviving member of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the others being the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, the Colossus of Rhodes, the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, the Mausoleum at Halicarnassus, the Lighthouse of Alexandria, time 0.65s, and the statue of Zeus at Olympia. For about 3,800 years, it reigned as the world's tallest human-made structure. It's the largest pyramid in Egypt, rising originally to roughly 480 feet. Building it required an estimated 2.3 million limestone blocks, with some stones weighing as much as 80 tons. Ancient sources like Herodotus claimed the project took 20 years and involved 100,000 workers. Modern archaeology suggests a more nuanced picture, with a permanent labor force of around 20,000, supported by bakers, physicians, craftspeople, and spiritual officials, swelling seasonally when the Nile flooded and farmers had time to join the effort. Even after 2 centuries of stud time 0.65s, the pyramid can surprise. In 2017, researchers used cosmic ray moon detection to identify a hidden void inside, at least 100 feet long. Its purpose is unknown. It's too large and regular to be the result of haphazard collapse. Egyptians engineered these structures with extraordinary care. The void may be a relieving chamber, an unexploited gallery, a construction span, time 0.65s, or something we don't yet have the imagination to name. Until a non-invasive way is found to study it more closely, it will remain a hole in knowledge, as suggestive as it is empty. One shouldn't imagine pyramids as hollow warehouses of treasure. Most of the volume is solid stone, yielding only a few chambers. In those, space to time 0.65s. However, Egyptians tucked protective figurines called ushabti, little servant stand-ins meant to come to life in the afterworld and perform labor on behalf of the deceased. When you picture thousands of objects fitting into a small tomb, it becomes clear how artful the arrangement had to be, and how packed some of these spaces were when Carter squeezed through. Not all discoveries are gilded and serene. Some are downright grisly. In one case, archaeologists found 16 human right hands carefully buried in 4 pits. At first glance, their size and condition made them hard to recognize. But they were indeed hands, and all right hands at that. The find dovetails with depictions and texts documenting a ritual in which warriors presented the severed right hands of enemies as proof of victory, receiving gold in exchange. In a culture that believed strongly in the afterlife, removing a hand could be seen as permanently diminishing an enemy's power beyond death. The context of the find suggests it may relate to conflicts between Egyptians and the Hyksos, a group that ruled parts of northern Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period, and whose origin lay in the Near East, in areas once called Canaan. Such finds pull no punches. They remind us that ancient life included not only shimmering art, but also brutal practices. Papyrus, the writing material that gave paper its name, opens a gentler window into the past. Crafted from the pith of the papyrus plant, it served as the primary writing medium for thousands of years along the Nile. One recently highlighted scroll, unrolled from a tomb south of Djoser's Step Pyramid at Saqqara, stretches a stunning length, so long that its height would rival the world's smallest skyscraper in Wichita Falls, Texas, if you stood it on end. That remarkable roll preserves a compendium of funerary texts, akin to what we call the Book of the Dead, collecting spells, hymns, and vignettes guiding the deceased through perilous regions to a blessed afterlife. These texts still circulate today in translated editions, their poetic imagery and solemn assurances bridging time. Saqqara, the great necropolis of ancient Memphis, has been the stage for another astonishing find, one of the oldest and most complete mummies yet recovered. The man, likely of considerable wealth, lay at the bottom of a deep shaft. His body, encased in layers of gold leaf, wore symbols of status, a band around the head, a bracelet-like adornment over the chest, and a finely woven tunic, garments once reserved for an elite. The burial shaft's ceiling mortar remained intact until modern archaeologists breached it, making it a time capsule undisturbed for some 4,300 years. It's rare enough to find a tomb unlooted, rarer still to find one with such richness of personal adornment and evidences of social rank. Pyramids themselves can go missing, not because they sprout legs and walk away, but because wind and sand can erase everything above the base over millennia. One such structure at Saqqara, nicknamed the Headless Pyramid, was first identified in the 19th century, but subsequently swallowed again by dunes. Its top was gone even then, and by the time modern teams returned, the site had to be re-excavated to reveal the foundational layers. Removing a 25-foot blanket of sand is no small task. Once cleared, the base allowed specialists to connect the structure to a known ruler. Such identifications often rest on fragments of inscriptions or the style of architectural element, time 0.95s. Saqqara is also famous for the Serapeum, vast underground galleries where sacred Apis bulls were interred. The Apis bull was believed to be a living manifestation of Ptah in Memphis and had specific markings, ideally all black with a distinctive white patch on the forehead or between the horns, among other signs that priests watched for in selecting an animal. After an Apis bull die, time 0.65 huz. Its body was mummified and placed in a heavy sarcophagus, and processions honored its passage. The reverence accorded to these animals underscores a broader theme. In Egypt, The sacred often wore animal form, and humans, bulls, cats, ibises, crocodiles, baboons, even beetles, could be vehicles of divine presence. While royal mummies monopolize headlines, vast numbers of non-royal burials also lie beneath the Egyptian soil. One site, nicknamed the Way of the Water Buffalo, has yielded thousands of mummies and may contain up to 1 million, dating to Egypt's later periods under Roman and Byzantine control, roughly 1,500 years ago. These people were not kings or noble huvah. They were ordinary men, women, and children, commoners wrapped with care and laid to rest in a mass cemetery. Teams have excavated around 1,700 burials so far, and the work underscores how a single site can be an ocean of human stories. The cemetery's nickname conjures pastoral scenes, but the science is rigorous. Samples, stratigraph, time 0.65s, and context help reconstruct diet, disease, and demography during an era when Egypt was a province of larger empires. At the other end of the status spectrum are mummified animals offered as votive gifts. In a place dubbed the Valley of the Monkeys, archaeologists unearthed numerous mummified baboons. Baboons were associated with Thot, the god of wisdom and writing, often depicted as an ibis-headed deity, sometimes accompanied by baboons. The animal's remains, however, tell a sadder story of how devotion sometimes translated into captivity. Bone studies suggest many of these baboons suffered severe vitamin D deficiency, indicating they spent little time in sunlight, and signs of malnutrition suggest they were poorly fed. Behind the piety lies a cautionary tale about the costs paid by animals pressed into service as religious symbols. Some discoveries are as glittering as the gold they contain, and as weirdly evocative as their symbolism. Excavations have turned up mummies with golden tongues, their natural tongues removed or covered and replaced with thin gold plate. The idea, according to one interpretation, was to equip the deceased to speak before the gods in the afterlife, perhaps especially before Osiris during the judgment, or to communicate with certain deities who required a purified tongue. These burials often include other goods, necklaces, pottery, gold ornaments in the shape of lotus flower, time 0.65s, scarabs, and the usual range of amulets. The presence of these items blends piety with prestige. If the occasional modern wag jokes about finding a smartphone among the grave goods, it's only because the array of accessories feels so tailored and complete in its own context, everything you might need, save for technology undreamed of then. The Egyptian religious landscape was fluid, layered, and receptive to influences. In the Sinai Peninsula, archaeologists identified remains of a temple likely dedicated to Zeus Cassios, a syncretic deity blending the Greek Zeus with Mount Cassios, Jebel Akra, and associated local gods. 2 pink granite columns peeking from the sand marked the spot. Evidence suggests the colonnade collapsed in an earthquake, toppling elements that once framed a sacred threshold. Egypt's long history saw many such crossings and hybridizations, especially in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, when Greek and Egyptian deities often intermingled in art and worship. Intermingling wasn't only theological. Everyday objects show cultural crosscurrents and personal taste. A gold ring depicting Bes was found in a city south of Cairo. Bes is a delightful, protective deity, a dwarf-like figure shown with protruding tongue and leonine features, a god of laughter, music, and mirth, but also of strength and safeguarding. He's a household protector and a defender of women and children. Time 0.95 s. His cheerful grotesquerie appears on amulets, headboards, and cosmetics jars. That same protective bent may explain why Bes appears in tattoos on some ancient Egyptian women. Mummies with preserved skin are rare, but in a handful of cases in the Nile region, tattoos have survived. 2 women bore simple tattoos on their lower back, time 0.65s, imagery that seems linked to childbearing and protection. Among the motifs, Bes again, playful and fierce, an ideal guardian to ink into the skin over the womb. Tattoos, then, weren't merely decorative. They were enchantments, etched into flesh. Automation might sound like something out of modernity, but the Egyptians also experimented with mechanisms, often hidden inside statues. A wooden figure long held by the Metropolitan Museum of Art was later found, under X-ray inspection, to contain an internal system, an axis or rod, running from the shoulder to the left leg. When manipulated, the figure's arm rises and falls, as though the deity were signaling or blessing. While it's not a robot in our sense, it's a mechanical device designed to animate a sacred image, time 0.65 s. Perhaps used in ritual to astonish or to give tangible presence to divine agency. Such finds remind us that the line between art and engineering has always been more porous than we suppose. And then there is the perennial question that refuses to die. How were the pyramids built? Without modern cranes, bulldozers, or steel, how did ancient workers hoist multi-ton stones hundreds of feet high and align them with such precision? The leading theory involves the use of ramps, straight, zigzagging, or wrapping around the pyramid in a spiral. Workers would haul stones on the sledges over lubricated slipways, using levers and manpower to inch them into place. Herodotus wrote of sledges, rollers, and levers as primary tools, and of a 20-year construction timeline with an enormous labor force. Today, archaeologists who excavated the workers' village near Giza describe a more organized, professionalized workforce, thousands of laborers living in barracks, supplied by bakeries that turned out bread on an industrial scale, aided by physicians who set bones and treated injuries, and boosted seasonally by farmers idled during the inundation. There are niche theories, too, like the notion that some pyramids grew from the top down over natural hills used as quarries, with the hills progressively cut down and squared. It's not mainstream, but it hovers on the periphery, a reminder that even outlandish hypotheses can spur useful questions. Whatever the precise methods, the pyramids endure as monuments not only to pharaonic ambition, but also to the organization, skill, and perseverance of a working population. Another colossal undertaking, literally, was the quarrying of obelisks. At Aswan, a giant, unfinished obelisk still lies attached to the bedrock, partly freed, partly encased in trenches. The tool marks along those trenches have puzzled and fascinated researchers. Some argue that handheld dolerite pounders chipped away at the granite day after day, leaving a pebbled texture. Others point to uniform horizontal striations along the trench walls, suggesting a repetitive motion of a tool that rests at intervals, leaving parallel band time 0.95 s. According to one expert, such marks could be consistent with a tool rocked back and forth to widen the trench, maintaining its width and preventing it from pinching. That interpretation raises the tantalizing specter of more sophisticated methods than typically assumed. There is also the matter of stone drilling. Flinders Petrie, a pioneering Egyptologist, collected cores from ancient drill holes in materials ranging from limestone to hard granite. The spiral marks on those cores have sparked debates. Were they made by copper tubes with abrasive sand, or by something more advanced? The consensus remains that abrasives did the heavy lifting, but the precision and speed implied by some marks leave room for continued investigation. It wasn't all heavy industry and monumental architecture. The Egyptians also shaped the intimate tools of daily life. They invented handheld mirrors, gleaming discs polished from bronze or copper, often mounted on handles carved into elegant shapes and sometimes inscribed. Their concern with grooming and hygiene led them to create toothbrushes, chew sticks from frayed twigs, and toothpastes made from ground rock salt, dried iris, mint, and pepper. Modern dentists who tried a reconstructed recipe found it surprisingly effective at cleaning, if a bit abrasive and spicy. Other concoctions relied on ash, which cleaned but did nothing for bad breath. Enter the breath mint. Egyptians crafted lozenges from heated sweet spices like cinnamon mixed with honey, early answers to the age-old desire for fresh breath. They were also pioneers in what we'd now call interior design. While Mesopotamians began the tradition of decorated furniture, the Egyptians expanded it dramatically. Chairs, beds, and chests were adorned with inlays, painted motifs, and carved animal legs. They experimented with inks in various colors and papers in different weights. Papyrus sheets were not uniform, and even wove papyrus mats and rugs to soften floors. Figurines were everywhere. Cats arching their back, time 0.65 s, dogs sitting alert, people frozen mid-dance or prayer. A peasant might own one molded from sun-dried mud. A noblewoman might cherish one in gold. What we display today on mantels and bookshelves echoes a taste formed long ago on the Nile. For all their artistry, they were practical farmers at heart. Clean water and reliable irrigation made the Nile's valley a garden, and Egyptians developed tools and systems to make the most of their landscape. They hitched plows to oxen, heavy plows to cut deep furrows, and light ones to break clods and aerate soil. After sowing, they would lead flocks or herds across the field to press seeds into the earth and close the furrows, a living roller doing what modern machinery now accomplishes with steel. But none of this mattered if water couldn't be brought to the fields. That's where Egyptian ingenuity really shines. They perfected irrigation networks and timing keyed to the flood, a hydrological intelligence so impressive that later civilizations, Greeks, Romans, learned from it, borrowed techniques, and praised its result, time 0.95 s. Now, to grasp how this system actually worked on the ground and how the Nile's rhythm shaped it, we need to look closely at the devices, the canals, and the calendar that made Egyptian agriculture hum, and at the human labor organized, skilled, and ceaseless that kept the water moving where it needed to go. Let's change pace for a moment and linger over the astonishing architecture of ancient Egypt. These people weren't only master cultivators of the Nile's floodplains. They were also consummate builders and designers with an eye for beauty and a knack for solving problems that would challenge even modern engineers. They didn't just dig canals to ferry water to fields and fishing villages, they sculpted entire landscapes. The irrigation channels they carved were as much about aesthetic harmony as they were about function, edged with stone embankments and adorned with columns, statues, and gardens. Picture yourself walking along one of those waterways as the late afternoon light turns the limestone warm and golden. Palm fronds rustle, and meticulously carved embankments throw reflections that shimmer like hieroglyphs on the surface of the water. Their canals weren't merely efficient. They were meant to be seen, to proclaim both abundance and elegance. When it came to grand statements in architecture, few rulers were as ambitious as Ramesses the Great. He was forever building temples, statues, avenues of sphinxes, and he wanted those monuments to speak across centuries. One of his most extraordinary achievements sits at Abu Simbel, where two massive rock-cut temples were engineered with breathtaking precision. Twice a year, on dates that align with the temple's celestial orientation, the rising sun reaches deep inside the main sanctuary to illuminate statues of the gods and Ramesses himself. Imagine that. A ray of sunlight traveling over desert and stone, threading the darkness, and bathing a carved visage in light. It's a reminder that these builders didn't merely stack stone. They choreographed nature itself, turning sunlight into a ritual instrument. The Egyptians also mastered building techniques that allowed them to create internal spaces of real ingenuity. Consider the corbel arch, a method of layering stone so that each course projects slightly inward until they meet, creating a roofed passage. This technique was a quiet revolution. Without corbelling, many of the awe-inspiring internal chambers and corridors, including those related to the Great Pyramid complex, would have been impossible on the scale we see. Corbelled spaces function like stone-made domes and vaults without requiring a true arch, distributing loads and preventing catastrophic collapse. That deceptively simple idea unlocked possibilities for tall, stable structures and grand interior halls that still stop us in our tracks. Walk through the legacy of their temples, enormous, hypostyle halls dense with columns soaring like stone forests, inner sanctuaries cloaked in a hush that feels almost electric, and you find that some of these sacred places doubled as astronomical instruments. Temple axes and window-like apertures aligned to the stars and the path of the sun, marking equinoxes, harvests, and ritual days. Priests could watch the heavens from platforms and open courts, tracking Sirius, plotting the Nile flood, and embedding celestial rhythms into daily life and sacred ceremony. Practical science and spiritual meaning were joined at the hip, and their temples became living calendars. Most people today know that pyramids were built as monumental tombs for pharaohs, designed to protect and empower the ruler as he journeyed to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Giza, enormous, austere, and nearly perfect in its geometry, was built for Pharaoh Khufu. Yet the tradition didn't burst onto the scene fully formed. It began with a bold experiment, the Step Pyramid of Djoser, roughly 4,700 years ago. Constructed during Egypt's Third Dynasty, time 0.65 s. This structure was not a simple copy of earlier tombs. It was a conceptual leap. Rising in a series of stacked terraces far above the surrounding desert, the monument stands around 200 feet tall, a mountain of stone in a world of earth and reed. From our vantage point, it's easy to see Djoser's Step Pyramid as a masterpiece, and it is. But for its builders, it may also have been a trial run, a full-scale prototype for even more audacious feats to come. The idea of reaching ever higher was intoxicating, but equally compelling is what was happening underground. Beneath that stepped profile lies a labyrinthine network of tunnels, corridors, and chambers. The underground system is long. Estimates vary, but some describe it as extending roughly 3.5 miles, depending on how you trace the passages and how you convert ancient measurements. It is a place not just of passage, but of intention, where the architecture below mirrors, in complexity and ambition, the stone mountain above. Some researchers propose that parts of this subterranean layout might have been designed for water management. That notion challenges the way we think about pyramid building, and it dovetails with evidence found in the broader complex at Saqqara. Picture the area around Djoser's pyramid. Encircling it is a feature known as a dry moat, a continuous trench up to about 164 feet wide, roughly rectangular, and almost 2 miles long if you follow its outer course. It's not just a shallow scrape. On average, it drops some 65 feet. If you collected all the rock and earth carved from this trench, the volume would amount to roughly 10 times the mass of the pyramid itself. For a long time, people assumed the trench was a quarry where builders extracted stone and clay for the pyramid. That assumption makes superficial sense until you look closely. On inspection, the trench is too narrow and deep to be a practical quarry. Its shape doesn't conform to known patterns of ancient Egyptian quarrying, which typically favored broader, more accessible cuts. In some places, the trench is even capped with rock, creating cavern-like ceilings and complicating any straightforward extraction. The layout speaks less to mining and more to a deliberate system, something carved with an eye to flow and compartmentalization rather than mere removal. Another school of thought holds that this dry moat had spiritual significance. Perhaps it was a ritual boundary, or a sacred channel within which the souls of nobles gathered in service to Djoser after death. Niches carved into the walls seem to give this theory a foothold, hinting at ceremonial placements or offerings. But many scholars argue that, if those meanings were attached to the trench at all, they crystallized later, in eras after Djoser's time, when the complex had been standing long enough to gather new stories like a ship gathers barnacle. And so what was the trench for? In 2020, a researcher put forward an intriguing hypothesis. The trench could have been built to collect and manage water, especially during periods of heavy rain. The idea gains traction when you consider the topography. Runoff from the surrounding plains could have coursed toward the pyramid complex, filling lower-lying areas. In such a scenario, the trench becomes a catchment system, an engineered basin designed to guide, hold, and process water instead of letting it flood or erode the site. This could also explain why burials in the trench are relatively late and sparse. If the area was periodically inundated in earlier centuries and later became drier, it would have become more suitable for grave cutting only as the climate shifted. Take that idea a step further, and the trench begins to look like part of a larger hydrological design. Within its carved walls appear a series of compartments connected by tunnels or channels. Imagine water entering a first basin, the sediment settling out. Then it flows to another compartment for further clarification. The water moves gradually, basin to basin, time 0.65 s, cleaner each time. The way a modern wastewater facility uses a sequence of treatment steps. In this reading, the stone isn't just a fence around the pyramid. It's a machine designed to harness a force of nature. Now, connect that concept back to the pyramid. The Djoser complex contains multiple underground shafts, deep vertical spaces that look, at first glance, like tomb shafts or storage. But what if? Some researchers suggest water collected and partially purified in the trench system could be fed into these shafts to power a hydraulic lift. Here's the mental picture. At the center of the building site, a deep pit houses a massive wooden platform, basically a raft inside a well. When workers needed to raise a heavy stone, they would fill the shaft with water. As the water level rose, the platform would float upward, carrying the block like a slow ascendant elevator. When the block reached the necessary height, the crew would slide it onto the growing structure, time 0.95s. Then they'd open sluices, let the water drain out, and the platform would sink back to its starting point, ready for the next cycle. The analogy that's often used is a volcano, but one that erupts water, not lava. You have an immense vertical chamber, a force rising from below, and then a release. If you can picture that rhythm, you can appreciate the elegance of the proposal. Instead of armies of men dragging stones up long ramps, perhaps the Egyptians channeled water to do some of the heaviest lifting. The trench around the complex becomes the source and regulator. The shafts become pistons, and the stones ride up on buoyant ingenuity. even as this idea fascinates. It has skeptics. One criticism is straightforward. The plateau where Djoser's pyramid was built may not have had enough sustained water supply from sporadic rains to keep such a system operating. Some proponents of the theory counter with the possibility of a nearby lake or seasonal basin that filled during certain times of year, providing an intermittent but sufficient reservoir. The challenge is that ancient texts don't mention such a lake. Without inscriptions or clear hydrological traces, the lake remains a hypothesis. Then there's the brute math of labor. The dream of letting water do the heavy lifting is attractive, but the construction of a robust hydraulic device, sealed shafts, large watertight basins, strong wooden floats would also require heavy resources and skilled craftsmanship. Some engineers argue that building and maintaining such a device might have been even more labor-intensive than simply hauling blocks up embankments and ramps, especially given the scale of Djoser's stones. And speaking of scale, time 065s. The stones used in Djoser's step pyramid averaged roughly 660 pounds apiece. That's impressive, but far lighter than the 2.5-ton blocks used later at the pyramids of Khafra and Khufu. If the water lift technique existed, it would have to have started in more modest form and then been upscaled drastically, or abandoned as impractical. If this elegant water lift hypothesis ultimately doesn't hold up, we still have a solid, conventional explanation for how the step pyramid rose skyward. The project began not as a step pyramid at all, but as a mastaba, an earlier, common tomb type with a flat roof and sloping sides. The plan changed midstream. The builders added another layer on top, and then another, and then kept going until they had 6 distinct tiers, each one smaller than the one below. In that scenario, ramps are the unsung heroes of the story, not water. Crews could have dragged stones up earthen or rubble ramps, adjusting the approach path as the structure grew. Piece by piece, lift by lift, they transformed a flat tomb into the first monumental stairway to the heavens. There's still so much we don't know about the Djoser complex. The trench's exact function is debated. The tunnels below hint at a combination of storage, ritual, and engineering, and the whole site acts as a palimpsest, layers of intent and reuse inscribed one over the other. Whether or not ancient Egyptians used water to hoist stones, the very possibility enlarges our sense of their imagination. It reminds us that they were audacious problem-solvers who married landscape, physics, and ritual in ways that still surprise us. Their legacy whispers, "Don't underestimate what patient minds and coordinated hands can do, even with the simplest materials." Not far from Djoser's innovations stands another enigma that has captured the world's imagination for generations, the Great Sphinx of Giza. You've seen its profile in textbooks, postcards, and documentaries: a lion's body, a human head, the gaze tilted slightly toward the rising sun. Carved from the bedrock roughly 4.5 millennia ago, the Sphinx is both familiar and mysterious, towering yet reticent, as if in the midst of a riddle it refuses to fully share. Scholars still debate the specifics of its creation, its exact date, the identity of the builder, and the original purpose. Plenty of theories swirl, but hard confirmation remains elusive. What is certain is that the Sphinx was not always the weathered, monochrome sentinel we see today. It was originally painted. Traces of pigment cling to sheltered surfaces, whispering of a time when the monument blazed with color under the Egyptian sun. Envision the body painted in earthen reds and yellows, the headdress highlighted, the face delineated with lines that gave expression to the immensity. Time has stripped away much of the surface, but not the grandeur. Even the name we use is an import. Sphinx is a Greek word, attached to the statue centuries after it was carved, inspired by their own mythological creature. The Egyptians seem to have known it as something like Hor-em-Akhet, Horus in the horizon, an embodiment of solar power and protective kingship. Names matter. They hint at function, at how people saw the object in their spiritual geography. To the Egyptians, this wasn't just a marvel of stone. It was a mediator, a guardian, a horizon point where earth and sky met. Legends cast the Sphinx as a watcher, protecting not only nearby tombs but also the secrets of ancient Egypt. Those whispers picked up momentum when archaeologists identified sealed or hidden entrances at the statue's paws. Could these be the mouths of tunnels? People wonder, time 065s, leading to hidden chambers or forgotten caches. The imagination leaps easily to treasure, gilded funerary goods, ritual implements, but in recent decades, a specific legend has taken root online and in fringe histories, the Hall of Records. This fabled library supposedly houses scrolls and artifacts from a lost civilization, Atlantis. According to the tales, the entrance lies next to the Sphinx's right paw. Searchers have tried time and again to find it, only to come up empty. There are even hand-drawn maps and intricate diagrams circulating on the internet, showing a sprawling underground city beneath the plateau, with vaults as high as 12-story buildings. None of that has been verified by evidence, but the stories persist, fueled by the Sphinx's aura and the natural human impulse to ascribe grand secrets to grand objects. Archaeologists continue to probe carefully, balancing curiosity with caution. In 1998, investigators reported tunnels leading to empty cavities beneath the Sphinx, as well as signs that others, perhaps in earlier eras, had already explored there. It's tantalizing to imagine that someone, long ago, reached hidden chambers first and quietly removed whatever was inside. Some people take this further, claiming that an artifact of astonishing technological power, something out of time, was discovered and hidden away, its capabilities too disruptive to reveal. The sober truth is likely much less dramatic. Still, even those skeptical of the wilder theories acknowledge a real and documented fact. Beneath and around the Sphinx lies a system of cavities, fissures, and man-made room, time 0.95s. Some are natural voids widened by humans. Others are cut spaces whose functions we don't fully grasp. Sorting truth from rumor in this terrain is hard. Excavating beneath a monument of this significance is not only technically challenging, but also risky. Cut too much, or in the wrong place, and you could destabilize parts of the structure or trigger a collapse. Time 0.95 s. Entrances to underground spaces could be blocked forever by fallen rock. Funding is another constant hurdle. Large-scale projects require money, permits, and patience, and none of those are easy to assemble for an undertaking that might disrupt a world treasure. There's also a human dimension. Many Egyptians feel a deep spiritual connection to the Sphinx and the plateau, and some are wary of prying too aggressively into old, sacred ground. Add to that the basic dangers of going into a complex, partially mapped maze and finding your way out again safely, and you begin to understand why exploration has been slow and cautious. The Sphinx doesn't yield its secrets easily. Perhaps that is part of why it continues to enthrall us. From one monumental face to another, let's move continents and centuries to a different kind of stone visage, Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. Most visitors come to gaze up at the 4 monumental presidential faces carved into the granite, each profile clean and massive against the sky. But behind the head of Abraham Lincoln, there's a hidden room with a story of its own. The sculptor behind Mount Rushmore envisioned a grand historical record, a series of inscriptions chiseled into the mountain itself, chronicling key stages in the nation's story. The scope of that plan was enormous, perhaps too enormous. When that proved unworkable, he pivoted to a more contained vision, a secret chamber within the mountain that would serve as a kind of time capsule. The goal wasn't secrecy for secrecy's sake. It was preservation. The idea was to house documents and records so that hundreds or even thousands of years from now, people could step inside and understand how the United States saw itself in the early 20th century. The sculptor, however, didn't live to complete the chamber. Work halted, and for decades the space sat unfinished, more in tension than reality. Then, in the late 1990s, a renewed effort brought the chamber closer to the original intent. Porcelain enamel panels, durable, vivid, and archival, were installed, depicting touchstones of American history. The chamber isn't on the tourist circuit. It's not an observation room. It remains out of reach to the general public, hard to access, and intended to guard its contents rather than showcase them. Think of it less as a museum and more as a vault of memory, a place where a version of our national narrative waits in the quiet. Across the country, in the heart of New York City, the Empire State Building hides its own surprises above the clouds. Most people who visit ride the elevator to the 86th floor observatory, stand shoulder to shoulder with other visitors, and peer out over Manhattan's grid. What many don't realize is that there's another observatory, smaller, higher, calmer on the 102nd floor. Up there, enclosed by panoramic windows, the city feels even more crystalline, the rivers more like silver ribbons, the burrows laid out like a geography lesson under glass. It's open to the public, but fewer people make the trek, so the wait is shorter, the air less crowded. You stand there and feel, briefly, like you are in on a secret. Even higher, one level up, is the 103rd floor, a perch so exclusive and raw that it almost doesn't feel real. Celebrities and special guests sometimes have their photos taken up there, standing on a tiny balcony with a low rail and not much else between them and the open air. This isn't a space designed for crowds. It's too exposed, too precarious, and so it stays largely off-limits. Getting there is an adventure. You need permission, a guide, and a clear understanding of where you're going. The path involves choosing the right elevator, stepping into utility corridors where pipes hiss and electrical panels hum, and then climbing a tight staircase through the building's mechanical heart. When you finally emerge, the city unfurls around you, unmediated by glass or camera screens. It's both thrilling and sobering, a reminder that even in a building as familiar as the Empire State Time 0.65s, there are levels of experience most will never see. Hop across the Atlantic to Paris, where the Eiffel Tower rises, filigreed and unapologetically iconic. Most visitors ascend for the views or a meal, but inside that lattice of iron lives a quieter story, a secret apartment. Near the top, designer Gustave Eiffel created a private suite for himself when the tower opened in 1889. It wasn't extravagant so much as rarefied, a practical, tastefully furnished space in which he could host guests, step out onto a platform, and survey Paris from an eyrie few others could reach. Imagine living inside your own masterpiece, waking each morning above the city's rooftops, greeting visitors with the whole of Paris spread beneath the windows. Eiffel was the apartment's only resident. After his death, the space sat quiet for years. In recent decades, it has been restored and opened as a small museum, a capsule of late 19th century life perched atop an engineering marvel. Wax figures bring a moment to life: Eiffel, his daughter, and Thomas Edison, the American inventor, who visited and presented Eiffel with a phonograph, one visionary paying respects to another. The room itself is unassuming by modern luxury standards, yet its charm persists because of what it represents: a mind living inside a dream made real, a personal refuge inside a public monument. Back in New York, Grand Central Terminal thrums with commuters, travelers, and tourists. Beneath its celestial ceiling, articulated in constellations and stars, there's another unexpected amenity. Hidden behind doors and down corridors, you can hear the slap of a tennis ball and the thwack of a racket. A real tennis court operates inside the station complex as part of a private club. The club dates to the 1960s and today continues to host matches and corporate events. It feels like a secret even when you're standing on the court, as if you've stepped through a portal from a transit cathedral into a pocket of sporty calm. Few think to look for a court in a train station. And that's part of the delight, finding activity folded inside activity. A human rhythm tucked inside the city's larger pulse. Now to London, where secrets often hide in plain sight. Walk along Charing Cross Road, and if you keep your eyes down instead of up, you might notice something curious through the slats of a drainage grate. Little street signs reading Little Compton Street. There is no such street on your map. That's because the road above was built over it late in the 19th century. The signs you can glimpse through the metal are remnants affixed to the walls of old utility tunnels. Standing there, peering through the grate at a name that doesn't exist anymore, you're reminded that cities are layered like books, pages written, erased, and overwritten, with the older text still faintly visible if you know where to look. Another London curiosity waits in the southeast corner of Trafalgar Square. Amid the thrum of foot traffic and camera clicks stands what looks like an oversized lamppost, thick and slightly awkward. Step closer, though, and you realize its proportions could admit a person. That's because it's not just a lamppost. It's a tiny police station, the smallest in the world, by some accounts. Built in the 1930s, it served as a watch post from which a single officer could keep an eye on the square, a hot spot for gatherings both festive and unruly. Pickpockets, agitators, and petty criminals all knew Trafalgar's energy. So did the police. The little post was a practical solution. Put a set of eyes right where they were needed, discreetly, in the very heart of things. Today, it's more of a curiosity than a key piece of law enforcement. But it remains a testament to the city's habit of tucking function into form, of hiding usefulness inside what looks like ornament. If there's a common thread through all these places, from the engineered waterways of ancient Egypt to 20th century American landmarks and the secret corners of European cities, it's that builders and planners across time have had a talent for dual-purpose design. They put beauty and utility into conversation. They imagined not just what a structure would look like, but how it could behave, how it could gather water or knowledge or people, how it could align with the heavens or keep a watchful eye on a crowd. They also understood the power of mystery. A hidden room, a sealed tunnel, a sign glimpsed underfoot. These spark the imagination. They invite stories, some true, some wild, and they keep us returning to look again. Think back to the Egyptians and their canals, carved with both precision and pride. Those weren't built for one season or one festival. They were made to last, to transform the land into a dependable partner. Ramesses' temple at Abu Simbel didn't just honor gods and kings. It turned sunlight into a ceremonial performance piece that still works thousands of years later. The corbel arch is the kind of humble innovation that hardly gets notice in travel brochures. But without it, we'd be missing some of the very spaces that make Egyptian architecture so compelling. The step pyramid of Djoser remains a marvel, not only of mass, but of method, a sign that the path to mastery is often an experiment conducted at a heroic scale. The trench that puzzles researchers may be a quarry in disguise, a ritual boundary, or a hydrological machine, or some combination of these. And the very fact that we can't pin it down yet is a measure of its builders' sophistication. They knew how to make structures that were both obvious and opaque, whose purposes unfolded across years of use. The Sphinx, with its painted past and Greek-borrowed name, sits at the point where myth and engineering meet. We crave the idea that beneath it lies a singular secret, a library from Atlantis, a device beyond our own, but the truth of its concealed cavities is likely more human and more interesting: adjustments, repairs, explorations, and the inevitable accretions of ceremony and care. The caution we bring to digging there isn't cowardice. It's respect. There's a right way to ask an ancient object to tell its story, and sometimes that way is slow. In South Dakota, a sculptor's desire to etch a nation's milestones into a mountain had to be translated into a quiet, time do 65s, more protected form, a chamber where porcelain panels can sit and wait for a reader from the future. In New York, an extra elevator ride takes you to a calmer vantage, while one more level up requires the kind of access that proves some views are privileges. In Paris, a small apartment shows that even the most public symbol can have a private nook, a place to sit and think amid the frenzy. In Grand Central, a tennis ball cracks against a racket where most imagine only departures and arrivals. And in London, a buried street and a pocket-sized police post tell you that cities carry their own archives in their bones. Taken together, these stories offer a lesson in looking twice. The first glance gives you the postcard. The second glance, better yet, a lingering series of glances, reveals the hidden hydraulic logic under a pyramid, the ritual and pragmatic in a temple's alignment, the paint on stone weathered almost to nothing, the vault behind a president's carved head, the extra door to an empty observation deck, the apartment tucked among girders, the tennis court under a starry ceiling, the old street sign peeking through a grate, the small room pretending to be a lamppost. The world is full of second glances waiting to happen. And maybe that's why stories about water-powered elevators beneath Djoser's pyramid, or Atlantean libraries under the Sphinx, catch fire. We sense, rightly, that something more is often hiding behind what we can immediately see. Whether those specific tales are true matters less than the posture they encourage. Curiosity with a dose of humility. The best surprises, the ones that hold up, tend to be as practical as they are poetic. They reconcile a need with a vision, like captaining sunlight into a sanctuary twice a year, or cutting a trench that might be both boundary and basin, or setting aside a room not for visitors, but for posterity. In the end, the thread running from the Nile to the Black Hills, from Midtown to the Champ de Mars, from Charing Cross to Trafalgar Square, is an old and sturdy one. It is the human desire to build things that endure, to tuck meaning into materials, to use the landscape as a tool and a canvas, and, every so often, to leave a door slightly ajar so that another generation can step through and discover what was hidden in plain sight all along.